welcomed everyone, black seamen, queer people, and so on. People who wouldn't have been welcomed in ordinary places as themselves. Many women dressed as men and had men's names. Often their girlfriends worked as prostitutes. I can still feel the excitement of being able to be there as myself for 2 hours of the day and be with a girlfriend. She says, I used to change my clothes in the car before I went in. In those days in the Navy, we wore pinky rings to identify ourselves as lesbians. You had to identify either as butch or femme. I swapped between those choices, she said. And in fact, she was discharged from the Navy on account of, as many servicemen and women were, when their same-sex relationships were discovered. So, new mapping technologies mean that mapping has become, I'm trying to find the map again, has become very fashionable, yeah, in the past few years. You know, lots of history projects do mapping now. And I think we thought when we started doing this that, you know, crowdsourced mapping, you know, technology's out there, it's easy, it's straightforward. It's not quite as straightforward as that, though. These technologies are quite unevenly spread, raising questions of who has the time and money and access to manage them properly. So, do mapping technologies make an LGBTQ heritage map accessible to all? Is this truly a democratic method for queer public history? Who posts on it? And so whose history does this represent? I mean, the map will remain, we hope, as a resource for the future, as well as being a record of the past. Who has access to the technology? I mean, it's reasonably straightforward to pin somewhere on a map, but it's slightly clunky. Who has the technology, but also who has the time to do it? As I'll say in a moment, or Justin might also talk about the fact that, you know, this is a volunteer oriented project. We rely on people out there to post places on the map. Who puts stuff on any of these things? Who puts stuff on Wikipedia or TripAdvisor? Whoever has the time, I don't know. And of course, will it be representative of the diversity within LGBTQ heritage? So, as I've mentioned, we've built partnerships with community groups, some of whom have been much more active than others. Maybe I'll leave it to Justin to talk about the Nottingham group, but they vie with London for the number of sites on the map because they've, you know, got the people there have got the energy and interest to do it. And we've also got a Pride of Place blog from about Nottingham as well. Professional historians who work on LGBTQ history have also posted. We have several on our steering group, and of course we try to network nationally and encourage people to do that. And thank you for anyone in this room who's posted their sites. And in this slightly later stage of the project, there's also been a kind of intermediate level of mapping, which is quite interesting, which is where people who are volunteers, but kind of in a semi-official capacity. There's a staff member at Historic England, for example, who puts in a lot of hours on this project, as well as volunteers who have a small group of volunteers who are putting or have put material directly from academic books, lesbian and gay histories that exist, onto the map. So it's not sort of, you know, there are questions about how crowdsourced is crowdsourced, and, you know, what are the different intermediate levels of help that, you know, this wouldn't have been possible without. And Richter Norton kindly agreed, you know, to have much of his material put onto our map with acknowledgement to his work, as indeed we try to acknowledge all historians' work. So that's kind of one of the questions. And actually, my final, the question about what's the, you know, this is a kind of classic, I suppose, articulated in various ways in public history. You know, how can we maintain the project as democratic and accessible on the one hand, but also have credibility and academic rigor on the other hand? I mean, Historic England, of course, you know, are the government agency, and they've always wanted to protect their standards. They promote themselves as having, expertise in architecture and heritage and history. And certainly, it's an authoritative body, which makes it really important that it's paid for this project and is endorsing it across the heritage sector generally. So, and as academic consultants, we're also concerned with our own professional credibility. We don't want any old stuff floating around under our name. So, it's set up as a democratic wiki-like process, but, what kinds of authority does the map convey about its contents? We trialled an early version of the map as long ago now as May 2015, which feels like quite a long time ago now, doesn't it? And this was kind of with a self-selected group in London of people who were concerned and interested and committed to LGBTQ history. And they were quite divided on this issue. Some people wanted all information on the map to be absolutely verified, that they could rely on it, that it had to be reliable and accurate, and saw this as really important. And others believed equally strongly that the range of perspectives and interpretations that were available through crowdsourcing was the most exciting part. Why don't you go out and interview people, etc., etc. Well, we'd love to if we had the time and money. And of course, the answer to this, although I'm not suggesting that this is the final answer, is the wiki answer, that it should be self-correcting. People can add further information. People can say, well, that's not my view of, this club in the 1980s or whatever. My experience was different. But, are we able to encourage this enough? Is it actually happening sufficiently? And of course, it also raises questions about what is the status of various kinds of knowledge, and perhaps it has parallels with oral history and questions about popular memory. So this, what we're doing is a combination of popular and elite knowledge in a way. We're collecting places, we're collecting facts from various authors and, very different kinds of sources. So this map, or the body of knowledge that it represents and will continue to represent, suggests that this information or this knowledge is arrived at by consensus. It's not a truth which can always be footnoted. So just to sort of put that question out there, what is public history about? Is it about what is the status of the historical knowledge that it produces? So I suppose just to sort of finish, we certainly hope that the Pride of Place project will change heritage processes from the top down, and hope to influence historic England a little bit. At least that's what they said they wanted to happen, and also from the bottom up as a crowdsourced queer history resource. So that's me, and I'll hand over to Justin. Shall we swap seats?
We'll switch. Yeah. I'll put the map up on the on the screen.
Oh, and at some point, those are our contact details.
I'll put it back to that.
But you can just Google Pride of Place in historic England and you'll come up with everything you might need.
Can I give you one? Does anyone need a moment to take that down before I take it all away and put the actual map up online?
The Facebook page is great. Justin and now Claire put up a post at least once a week on an interesting building.
Yeah, we've managed to have buildings featured, blogs going up. We'll be writing some blogs ourselves, but we've also had guest blogs from people writing about, one about Nottingham. Nottingham features prominently in the project unexpectedly, and a blog about trans histories that was contributed by an individual as well. And that was published also at, so that was a horrible sound. There we go. And the other blog, the trans blog, was also published at Huffington Post. So it's getting pretty good distribution in terms of people being aware of the project and speaking to communities beyond our immediate one in academia in London, in the UK even. But to get to my portion of this evening, I want to focus more on the practical sides of mapping and the issues that we've encountered in trying to build this project around a crowdsourced map, at least in the first instance, before the other outputs that Alison described. And we always imagined the project as a crowdsourced one when we were putting the project together, and one that would really draw upon this collective of knowledge about the LGBTQ past, both in terms of this vast body of knowledge that's been written about by scholars, by public historians, popular historians even, but also from the wider general community that might be aware of various facets of LGBTQ history that hasn't yet distilled into official historical writing. And that's really important because there's so much material within living memory that there is no other record of. And so we've had quite an interesting task, both to think about how to access that kind of information, places for which there's no official historical record of it being an LGBTQ heritage site, and yet for individuals it holds that resonance and holds that importance from their own lives, their own experiences, from wider community experiences that might be acknowledged in that community but not recorded in the ways that we anticipate. But in looking at these questions, we've also wanted to explode outward what can constitute a location of LGBTQ heritage. And Alison was speaking to that at the beginning as well, that you saw the range of sites, some of the range of sites that we've already mapped. And we're trying to get contributors and participants to think as widely and as expansively as possible about what can constitute an LGBTQ heritage site, at least for this map. When we write up the exhibition that will be housed at Historic England, of course, we can only include so much on there. We want to do justice as best we can to the range of locations we found. But on the map, which is crowdsourced, hopefully that will expand, well, and continue to do so after we're no longer working on the project. We were at one event where a man in the audience said, well, what are you going to do? Because what are you going to happen if the entire map is just covered in blue and you don't see England anymore? That's fantastic. Would that happen? That would be absolutely wonderful to see, because of course that would suggest this this incredible both volume of material, but also necessarily the incredible range of places that can be included under the umbrella of LGBTQ history. And looking at the map, you can see the categories. You might be able to read that a bit easier now on the projection, that we're looking across a number of categories. So the typical things that might appear also in historical literature: activism, crime and the law, pubs and clubs. These are very well represented in historic documents, at least insofar as LGBTQ history can be. Those are quite represented as well. But we've wanted to look as well at love and intimacy, something that evades definition a bit, and our contributors have sometimes wondered what exactly is included in that. Or domestic spaces, getting people to think about their own homes and spaces of domestic relationships as having an historical resonance and importance. And I think that's been something that we've set out for ourselves as well, is to really get contributors to think about everything that could be included in LGBTQ history. We've often said at presentations that every location has an LGBTQ heritage significance. And start thinking about the range of experiences that those can include. And I'll show you a couple examples a little bit later on that demonstrate exactly what that can in fact include. But convincing people in fact that their own experiences are relevant to heritage and to history is sometimes a bit of an uphill battle. Some people want to hear from the experts what constitutes history and what constitutes heritage, and for us to teach them and tell them what's important, and this is the stuff that you need to know about your past, your community's past, and if that's not your community, LGBTQ heritage and history for others. And in fact, we're trying to get people to think about the minutiae of their own lives as being historically significant as well, and the places where that happens as being worthy of identification on the map. So there's been quite a lot of outreach in that regard to having just these basic kinds of conversations, saying, tell me a story about your life. That can go onto this if you're willing to share it, if you're interested in sharing it, and you can see your way to how that could be identified with a location. It's one of the outreach strategies that we've had. Alison mentioned the pinning parties, and this was based around a similar initiative in the States, where there's a couple mapping projects underway that are similar to this. One by the National Park Service, which started out interestingly in it's a much bigger project and is transformed a bit into a crowdsourced mapping project, sort of. It was intended to be crowdsourced, to have people submitting places almost in a more formalized kind of way. People would email in and say, here's all the locations that you need to know about. And the woman who is leading that started building a map for herself as a visual tool to see how that was working and put that online, and in fact discovered that people were very interested in seeing that organized around a map and having that familiarity of the way of organizing the LGBTQ past end up becoming very, very useful to their project and subsequent ones. And certainly that's influenced us when we were writing up the proposal for this. So the pinning parties that they did, and that now we're doing some as well, serve multiple purposes. Obviously, the primary one being, let's get locations on the map and build awareness of the project and outreach to multiple communities. It's also a way to access communities that aren't as readily identifiable on the map, or whose histories aren't as readily told or recorded. So certainly the map, as expansive as it is, gay male history predominates, unsurprisingly. And so, of course, we've sought to do more with women's and lesbian history, with trans histories where we can, with some bi history, Black and ethnic minority histories, all of these areas that need further exploration and further interventions, but where work is ongoing and where overlaps between those histories and the queer past continues to be ongoing as well. But what we've ended up finding, interestingly, with the pinning parties is it ends up being much more a tool of interpersonal engagement, I'd say, and more almost like open houses about the project. People luckily take a lot of information about the project, and we found locations being pinned afterwards, after the event. People take information and thankfully continue to engage with it. But really, the pinning events end up being a lot about teaching people what the project is, and doing this kind of work that I've been telling you about, of getting people to engage with the idea that their own personal lives can constitute histories and heritage, and that they can be builders of history, and it doesn't need to be left to us so-called experts in every instance. Though, of course, we're bringing a lot of other research and knowledge and background to this to constitute that and contextualize, I should say, these histories. But it's really important to have that kind of engagement from the public, that kind of grassroots engagement and interest of them telling us, well, this is what I think constitutes LGBTQ history and heritage, and I want this to be represented in a map from a body as significant as Historic England. Looking a bit further at the map itself now, I mentioned the different categories that we've got here for actually adding a location. Oh, I should have logged in ahead of time. I'm used to a North American laptop. Now you all know my email address. I don't want to remember that. Anytime now. Oh, wrong password. Oh, gee. Oh, it could have been. You know what? We've got another one that's the LGBTQ places at, again, the @ symbol.
You can kind of create your own account, or we've also got an anonymous one that people can
Oh, actually, it's going to be capitals. It's capitals for the password, isn't it, Claire?
It's lowercase.
Everything?
Usually, yeah.
Everyday experience of the computer use.
There we go. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So, well, I mean, that does bring up one of the issues, that one of the obstacles with this map and with the other mapping technologies we used was people needing to log in. We did start with another provider called Z-Maps, allowed for no login, just show up, click a point, and start describing it, which of course removed a lot of the barriers to participation. But there was a lot of other glitches with that software that made it just untenable going forward, and a lot of difficulties people had then with the submission process. So this ends up being quite a balance between what type of mapping provider and software ends up offering the most useful information and the most ease of engagement, but then also basic levels of accessibility, and whether people want to have to log in, whether people want to create an account, whether people want their own social media accounts tracked by the software that's being used. And that's certainly something that our users brought up on numerous occasions, and we've created anonymous login accounts for them for that purpose. But of course, it still provides, there's a level of inaccessibility in that regard that we just can't get around with the current software. The ideal, of course, is to have our own bespoke, designed, GIS-based mapping and submission system, which is the ultimate end product of the map that we're working with Historic England. But they'll be transferring over the content that we've collected in the map information that we've got into something that would then be locally housed on Historic England servers and designed by their staff to reflect the questions that we want addressed in the software, the opportunities for submission that we want to address, the types of information people are wanting to submit, because of course everything we've used until now with the software that's off the shelf, as it were, is limited into the types of fields that are available for submission and how much we can customize that. So it's incredibly important when doing a project like this to be able to have that flexibility. So we've got basic information, a name for the place, the address, which it'll anticipate, description. Alison read some of those, including all range of information people might want to submit, from the most basic, this was a lesbian bar in 1952, to a long personal story that gives a lot more texture to that. And we've had everything in between. Keywords, we have over 100 keywords, in fact. So it covers everything that we could possibly think of, and users can create new keywords based on what for them is significant and what they want their location coded with. Web references, YouTube video has interestingly been something we've been able to submit for a few different sites. That's a bit of a bonus, I suppose. The kinds of sites then that people have submitted have ranged across all of that. So I want to as well quickly just take a look at a couple of those. So one, for instance, that I quite like is in Brixton. And finishing. I'm going to be terrible and not create a new site. And this woman submitted to the map. And she was describing, she doesn't identify as LGBTQ herself, but she wanted to tell a story in the 1950s about two men that lived in her neighborhood and that babysat her when she was a child, and the closeness that she felt for this the same-sex male couple, and the role that they played in her life of being emotionally engaged and providing love, and the importance that continues to hold for her, even though she doesn't know what happened to Cyril and Terry. She didn't stay in touch with them, but the experience of knowing these two men in the late 1950s, once she learned about the conditions under which these men lived, about criminalization, about the threat from the law and society that she was blissfully unaware of as a child in the 1950s. It stayed with her, and she was keen to map that story. But actually, the reason this one's on the top of my mind was because she got a hold of us then and said, "Oh, I have this experience, but how does this fit into a project like this?" So that then gets to that question that or that issue that I was mentioning earlier about what constitutes the LGBTQ past in a heritage location. She could potentially, well, she has put it to a specific address So it does identify with a location, but that level of just interpersonal intimacy and connection certainly tell. It's not something that would show up typically in a mapping project for the LGBTQ past, but I think it really demonstrates an incredibly important relationship that shouldn't be omitted from these stories and shouldn't be omitted from the LGBTQ past, because it illuminates so much about what elements of queer history actually engage with other communities, and how queer individuals in the past live in a community that expands beyond the immediate LGBTQ communities that we've often done, and the subcultural communities that we've often done research into. Another example is in Etchingham. And so both of the ones that I'm showing this evening are in our love and intimacy category, because that was something where we were trying to find more to put in there and expand out what can be included there. And what we found for love and intimacy as well is memorials and graves often tell very intimate stories of people's lives, and relationships that we might not otherwise have access to, or relationships that only are illuminated in death. And so we have the example here of a 15th century memorial brass at the Assumption of the Blessed Mary and St. Nicholas in Etchingham, for Elizabeth Etchingham and Agnes Oxenbridge. Early modernists in the room may already be familiar with this. But it is an example of a space of a church that could have multiple overlapping histories, LGBTQ histories as well. As Alison was saying, the church can hold a memorial to that demonstrates the relationship between these two women. It could also be a site where relationships have been solemnified afterwards. It could have been, some of the churches we've mapped have been meeting places for advocacy groups of later generations, or sites of sex and cruising, all in a single place, all overlayered across multiple centuries. And I think something that the map can do is really demonstrate that overlappingness of history over generations in a way that other ways of presenting the material doesn't do as effectively. And I think an ideal version of this map would better show those layers. And we haven't organized by categories, but I could well imagine something that demonstrates time in layers on a map. And certainly there's other projects that have been able to do that with other software. And I think for the LGBTQ past, that's especially relevant and resonant, given the incredible range of experiences that I've just described. In terms of community outreach as well, I think, well, I guess to start summing up a bit, the significance of the project overall, one of the significances is that engagement with the public on what constitutes the LGBTQ past, and diversifying what that can include. And up till now, we've mapped 1,325 places in England from Roman Britain to the present, and that does include all range of locations, including those that are currently active, because we've seen the project as well not only as a map to the past, but potentially an archive for the future. So we have had a lot of people spend a lot of time identifying clubs, pubs, advocacy locations, campaigning offices, things that potentially are going to be all too ephemeral themselves. And those are being mapped on the map, even as currently operating locations. And that's incredibly important, because nothing has been undertaken of that sort in the past to map these for us outside. I suppose there's been some wonderful local community queer walking tours and things like that that would be of their moment and recognize perhaps what might have been going on in those moments. But I think in terms of a more consistent mapping of not just the worthy sites of the present, but we've got, well, like I said, all range of locations, to ephemeral clubs, saunas, whatever individuals have identified as being LGBTQ locations. And that brings in Nottingham. It's been interesting to see who has engaged and who has not engaged as much in the project. And it does come down to, as Alison was saying, individuals with the enthusiasm to plot and add locations, and I should add our volunteers like Rob that are going through incredible amounts of information that we've made available to them online that can also be plotted. But Nottingham just happens to have, we've done very little active outreach to Nottingham, bar a few emails to announce the project and a few follow-up responses. But one man in particular there just really got engaged and has mapped hundreds of locations. You would never realize how queer Nottingham is. It is, in fact, the second, well, it is the most mapped location on Pride of Place after London. Probably adding up multiple Brighton, Manchester, a few other cities altogether, there aren't as many locations mapped. Of course, that brings up another issue of how representative does the map become when a place like Nottingham on this map is incredibly significant and suggests Nottingham as a queer wondrousness. I've never been, so maybe I'm not being fair to Nottingham. I need to go up there, but I'm living in Brighton right now, and I would have anticipated more locations in Brighton, but I suppose now I can be the volunteer that starts adding all kinds of locations to Brighton. But that does, I mean, it is important though to get more locations outside of the expected expected communities and cities of London and Brighton, for instance. And I think certainly LGBTQ history, though not exclusively, has emphasized the significance of London and the Southeast, especially in a project like Pride of Place, really allows us to think about what's going on in other places and what history exists in other places outside of Metropolis, and even of rural queer histories. Certainly, this project, again, because of the nature of who's involved in submitting locations and the access points that we have, urban histories naturally predominate, but it does leave space for non-urban histories to be included as well, and to suggest that there is far more than Soho as a location of the LGBTQ past. I think I'll leave it at that, because I think there's probably quite a few areas of conversation that we could continue with. So thank you all so much for coming to learn about the project, and we're very excited to speak further.
So thanks very much to our two speakers. If I can now ask Mira to come and talk to us from the digital history perspective. She'll start for a couple of minutes on her reflections, and then Claire from history, sexuality, and I'll do public history. So
Probably need to swap out for the camera.
Or standing between you.
Yeah, can you squeeze it?
Physically. So the moral of that story is that digital systems can create as many issues as working on physical projects. I suppose I was kind of struck by the advantage of the capaciousness of maps, and particularly digital maps that allowed you to record things that you would have to limit, and that kind of winnowing process that you'd have for an exhibition or for a publication. And the way that the map is set up in not forcing people to identify the kind of, they can label it by it was a bar or a venue or it was a house, but they're not having to label the sexuality, they're not having to grapple with the kind of more complex issues, and they're delaying that responsibility for actually labeling someone else's sexuality or labeling their own sexuality at the time. And I think thinking about digital tools in ways that avoid the convenience of labeling is really important. So it's encouraging to see digital projects that don't just put everything into a form or a checkbox just because you can, and just because a database is a wonderful thing that lots of historians are increasingly used to making. I think having worked on crowdsourcing, you see a lot of those issues with crowdsourcing projects where some people do an incredible amount of I think that attention to absences and silences and who's not being represented is really important. And I'd be curious to know how that will be represented as you move into other formats. So as you publish academic work about it, or as you do exhibitions, how will your sense of who's been enabled to post things to the site and the visual weight that Nottingham might have, which might not be most people's sense of Nottingham versus Brighton or Manchester, and how the truthiness of the visualization, the fact that something's on a map and it's digital and it makes it look really very true, for things that have degrees of truth and very subjective definitions of truth, and whether something was a club or a pub or a venue, or whether it was, what kind of venue it was, easily depended on who you were and why you were there and when you were there. So the issues in avoiding labeling things and delaying that and deferring that labeling as far as you possibly can in the digital project, I think is an interesting aspect of this work, and I look forward to seeing how you continue that. That's the kind of digital. Thank you.
I'm going to try and keep my history of sexuality account on as far as, well, I'm slightly biased now working on Pride of Place. I think what I'd like to reiterate is what both Alison and Justin touched on, and that's the way that histories of intimacies tie up in this, and that there's stories that might not be heard otherwise, but they certainly wouldn't get shared in the same way. So I was thinking about how oral history has had such a huge impact on community histories, and that usually involves one person being interviewed by one person. It can be in a group, but I think this project allows for different layered conversations. So like you mentioned, possibly someone commenting on someone's entry saying, actually, I used to go to that bar a couple of years after that and it was exactly the same, or it was slightly different. So I'd be curious to see, in years down the line, how are academic historians going to use this in a way that perhaps now they use oral histories. And I think that's a really good way of opening up, what constitutes LGBTQ history, and beyond that, from a history of sexuality perspective. Lots of these stories are nothing to do with sexuality and sex per se, but they're still really important to that. And I think the opening up of labels and saying, you've got domestic places and places that are bigger than that, has the potential to open up what histories of sexualities are as well, beyond sex. But I think really important is the intimacy and the not hidden histories, but stories that wouldn't get heard in the same way. I think that's a really key point. Thank you.
So I'm going to make just a few comments from the public history side of things. I think there's two things. The crowdsourcing issue is something that everyone, I think, has picked up on. The idea that, in a sense, you're providing a space and a forum for people to share their histories, our sense of heritage. But it also means they're inevitable. I think you put it perfectly, this kind of absences and silences, or was it me? Sorry. And I think that happens a lot in public history, is that you're giving a voice to people who can take it, if that makes sense. And the urban-rural thing, I think, also recurs. And often with public history, they tend to be focused on settlements. The museums tend to be, they're civic spaces. How do we find the voices and the stories of people who aren't in the places we might expect them to find, or in the places where they gather? I think that's a real challenge for public history as well. And the second thing is, I think this just really shows the importance of the kind of collaborative side of public history. There is so much that historians, I think, can gain from other parts of the field, but not only from within the discipline, but also outside the discipline. I mean, I think this clearly shows that geography and sociology and anthropology are all kind of fields in which historians should be playing, and public history has an inclination, I think, to do that, but it perhaps doesn't happen quite as much as it should. So I think this is a really good example of the way in which you've recognised that there is expertise that lies perhaps outside, one person's immediate remit, and those kind of forms of expertise can lock together the digital, the history of sexuality, and the public history. I think this is a really good example of that. And
perhaps we should be doing much more of these. I mean, perhaps there should never be a seminar that's just public history. It should be connecting those different parts of the discipline and showing how we relate to each other. So that's awesome. Great. So let's open it up. Let's have some questions, discussion, observations.
I thought it was fascinating to the project sounds amazing. It sounds like it's already done a lot of great work, even though it's still relatively early days. I just had a couple of comments about your categories, really, in terms of which is partly a politically motivated comment. So when you talk about love and intimacy, I wondered whether you might think about including family on that, because I think the idea of gay families is often positioned as something that's quite new, whereas actually it's got a much longer history. So the example that you gave from Brixton is wonderful, where the girls looked after by the two gay men. I mean, that would also fit under the category of family, and I think from a political point of view, it's good to show that there's a longer history in that. And I think the other theme is religion. So again, now there's a big association between religion and sex and same-sex desire, but broadly. But in the past, certainly in late 19th century, early 20th century, it was a big kind of tool for people to shape their own identity. So it was just kind of thinking about how you can maybe expand. Probably the last thing you want to do is expand your category. It was just thought. And one other thing was whether or not you're going to try and look at continuity of place over time. So, Peter Ackroyd talks about how, he says it really eloquently in a way that I'm not going to be able to, but how places retain character, often over centuries, that we only know when we look at moments in time. And it might be that you can do the same when you find that a certain place shows up across the centuries, and whether you thought about how you might, Covent Garden would be a good example.
I think with the categories, let's expand them out. Because I don't see what you're describing so much as creating more work or creating more categories, but refining the categories that we've got, which has been an ongoing process with the project, because we were initially limited to the number of categories, and so we were trying to find. Actually, this is a good point to bring up in terms of the digital side of things. The map limited us on the number of categories and the number of characters per category, so we had to be really judicious in what was included and how many. And how we described it. And we've been able to expand that now, which is why workplaces showed up, which is why love and intimacy became a new category. And I think adding family to love and intimacy makes perfect sense, because I think it's also really important to give those cues to people as to what can be included. And people might not think of family without seeing the word there. So I think that's incredibly useful. And I think I'll probably add that tonight.
I suppose just pick up the point about places over time, and that was also mentioned, that kind of, how bars change, how might this be used in the future. I mean, there are so many possibilities with this kind of map, and I'm thinking, well, it's a pity it's only going on until September 2016, but it would be, that would be an absolutely fascinating thing to do, to sort of, you can do it with a well-known site. Looking at a historic house associated with the queer past, as I've done myself. But that idea of having a sort of palimpsest of, what's happened here, and, why is it that this part of Brixton has often had, housing, how does it link over short periods of time, maybe 50 years, and how do it into those longer cycles of time? So, I think, as an academic, I'm really excited by that idea. And managing Proud of Place as a project, I kind of think, that's it's kind of up to it's a bit like it's a tool by anybody, and that's why I'm sort of thinking it's particularly there's only another 6 months that we know of. We hope historically will continue in usable form, but it might just sort of be frozen at that point. But it's a tool that historians can use for their own research, and we certainly welcome that. I'm just thinking that the reference to the religious identities and how those could be constants in that the recent edition of women's history review and so on. But I mean, that could, all those are possibilities. So basically, I'm saying yes, please use it as a tool for trying those things out.
Can I just make a quick comment, building on Alison, referencing Claire's comment about comments in the map, because I think that's something where in the future, were this project to be designed by Historic England with the organizational structure to the map that we would prefer, where comments are more easily submitted and comments engaged with further comments. I think having that kind of threaded conversation going about a place is incredibly useful. It would be that kind of almost an oral history witness event but threaded over weeks and years potentially as people engage with the conversation. So in terms of what Alison was saying about historians using this, I think it potentially offers an incredible resource and tool if it transforms effectively to better accommodate comments and engagement with the public on the sites that individuals haven't necessarily submitted. And I think there are examples and methodologies in place in other disciplines. Certainly when I was doing my graduate work, colleagues of mine in sociology and cultural studies and feminist studies were using online boards and lists as sources. They weren't students of history and weren't thinking of those as historical sources because it was the relatively recent past. But why not? Why couldn't that be an historical source as well? And I think that a comment thread that could emerge out of pride of place related to a location could be used similarly.
We have one right at the back, and then Rich.
So yes, thank you very much. It's an amazing project. So I worked on these kinds of databases myself, so I have a couple of related technical questions. So first of all, could I just ask for a bit more information about your plans for the future? So the project proper is not in processing after a certain amount of time, but the crowdsourced map will continue to be active. So something like that will require some form of technical and editorial oversight. So is Historic England going to continue providing that, or what your plans are? And secondly, is the data there, is it remotely accessible? Can I download it and on my own programs, offline, manipulate it, analyze it, or is it just on the project website?
Well, briefly, the answer to the first question is we don't know what's in terms of continuity. I mean, we've got a wish list, which Justin sort of described, that Historic England would write their own software to enable it to continue. But I mean, we have no control over that. I suppose in theory, the map could continue. Well, it can be quite messy if it continues in one place and not in another. But we don't. Continuity would be great, but we can't. It's not in our power to offer. And at the moment it's very lightly moderated, and that's why it can work. Really. And
in terms of being downloadable, that's one of the recommendations that we're making to Historic England, is that with their, I suppose once it's in their hands, we're certainly advocating that they make it publicly available, that not only would people be able to copy and paste manually information, which there's nothing stopping them from doing it now, but that's incredibly laborious and specific, but to actually download the full CSV file that has plotted location information with it to use for all kinds of other research potentially that we might not have envisioned. Certainly since it's drawn from the public, there's an argument to be made that the public should be able to use that information in a variety of manners that we might not foresee.
And can I just say that will also help to make it future-proof? Because obviously, technology changes, and there's certainly a lot of very interesting data sets that aren't quite as accessible as they used to be. Frustratingly.
Right. Well, and we've had to jump between software as well to have ones where it was more readily available for us to download the information that technically we own and have managed because it is held off-site and not by Historic England at this point. So when it is there, like I said, that's among the raft of recommendations we're making. Thank you.
All right, yeah, thank you very much for the presentations. From my own research perspective, I'm curious as to whether in the post-war period anybody's added any gun clinics to the list. But more seriously, a question or two about silences. If you could reflect on areas that you would have expected more descriptions or tagging than you've seen already. You mentioned the intimacy is lower, but if there was an anticipated area that is lower than expected. And then secondly, regarding, was there ever any thought to allowing people to read their testimony to capture recording? I know that there's a link to YouTube, but I wondered whether there were any ethical concerns. I know that voice is more recognizable and less anonymizable than text is, so that featured any concerns.
There's been no gum clinics that I'm aware of, so please, this is now the call to you. You've got some homework for the weekend. I think for me, the areas that didn't show up that I might have anticipated were geographical. That I did expect to see more in places like Brighton, or in I suppose places that I know from doing research. There's more that there's history available, but it is academic history that I'm familiar with. So it's been interesting to see that. I think thematically, I don't think there's areas that are not discussed that I expected. If anything, I've been learning incredible things that I never knew. I think that's the thing. Even researching in this area, there's not just living memory locations that I didn't expect, but historical ones that are just incredible and fascinating that I had no idea of. And I think it's been a great learning tool for me, and certainly any of us even in the field could learn a lot from it. And there was never any plan for people to read testimony into the project. It was always very text-based submission.
Yes. Next Wednesday, there's a meeting of the Garden History Society with Ashley Cooper, the Earl of Shaftesbury, as the topic. And the whole thing hovers around what is natural and nature and what is art and gardening. Now, they will be absolutely horrified and terrified when I make the comment saying, well, of course, he's queer. Now, that raises some interesting matters, because the word gay, the word queer, the word bent, the word homosexual are all going to be loaded. If he called himself a solemnist, he'd have had his head cut off, as he was also a deist or an atheist and a Republican or a Stuart. And with people around that time, the best known is probably Richard Boyle, the Earl of Burlington. And it's a pity the English heritage person isn't here, because there's a huge debate about whether Burlington was a Jacobite or a what, and they're all completely silent on the fact that he's queer. And the reason that Chiswick House is shaped the way it is that he couldn't have anybody scuttling up the stairs and discovering him. But they don't want to write about that sort of thing. And then we can pull in a handle, of course, because the whole of opera's queer before you start. I mean, there's no end to that one. William Kent is fairly well known. John Gay is fairly well known. But these all account to the problem of what do you consider to be legitimate evidence? Because you don't have the sticky moments, you don't have the stained sheets. And so how can you in any sense at all say that there is a community around the foundation of the English garden, which is actually a gay language, it's a queer language?
Well, we would welcome all of that. And this is one of the things that I think is happening with Historic England, not only Historic England, but also the National Trust want to sort of jump on board with this. And this is so, I mean, we've already pinned some of their sites. And as many of you may know, in some historic houses, the queer cast is acknowledged and has been for maybe 10 years. In the other historic houses, you know, where it obviously exists, it's not acknowledged at all. But I think what's interesting about this sort of contemporary moment is the way that suddenly the balance is changing, and the legitimising of queer history by Historic England hopefully will, you know, prod curators and heritage managers and other heritage organisations into being able to voice some of those histories. And it is, you know, it is interesting where it's where it can be said and where it cannot. I mean, I believe, and I think that there's a lot that can be said about queer architecture. I mean, there's huge debates about it. Is the layout of a particular house influenced by, you know, is the Gothic, you know, it's the Georgian Gothic, you know, a queer style and so on. And I think all of those debates are fascinating, and it's interesting to see how kind of how organisations like Historic England, or many people with obviously within Historic England really are supportive of this kind of project, but of course many people probably are not in many heritage organisations. So it's kind of interesting watching the kind of edginess with which they approach it. But yeah, the Garden History Society can come on board. I mean, you know, Historic England have encouraged this project, so hopefully that can be used as an argument for other establishment type organisations to not be so scared of this section. But just sorry. Do you want to have anything?
Yeah.
I think you were next. Yes, at the back.
I want to pick up on Mia's point about the truthiness of maps. I always think that easily usable map technology it usually requires you to put a dot on a map, right? It's a sort of, you settle on a latitude and longitude that's very precise and you go for it. When I'm kind of thinking of a project or a research project that involves computational technologies, so I always try and think about what I do with technology that's existed sort of before then. So if I just had a ruler and a map and a compass and a piece of paper and that kind of stuff. And I was thinking in this case that if you had a big piece of paper and you had pencils and rulers and maps and stuff like that, then you'd probably not just put down dots, but you put down lines, you put down circles, you put down squares, you put down blobs, and all these kind of different shapes, right? And I just wonder whether at any point you thought to yourself that the technology that you have at your disposal is kind of forcing the history that's being created here. And it came to my head when you were talking about the guy in Nottingham, over 100 sites in Nottingham, because I was wondering whether that person is writing about those individual dots in terms of their kind of placiness, or as part of a space that connects a number of places. So I kind of, intellectually then, do you think this is kind of forcing to some extent the public histories and the history of sexuality you've got going on here to conform in some way? It's not so criticism, it's more just sort of, I'm interested in that sort of the dot and what the dot is doing to us, because these open mapping texts, the easiest to use mapping texts always rely on that dot, tiny little dot.
I think in this project, the dot has falsely suggested a precision that doesn't exist for many of our locations, or for which we don't want for many of the locations, because that precision would be to deny something bigger than what's happening in that one building. I think it's come up most readily when individuals are submitting locations and they know roughly where something was, but we can't expect them to know the exact address that it was 50 years ago that they went to. They'll know roughly what street, maybe even just, oh, it was near these streets. I think what would be ideal in that instance is if we could change the opacity of the dot and say this is a more one that actually where the specific that house is important can be a full 100% opaque dot, and something that is more diffuse in the neighborhood need not be so strong in the color. I think there's a lot that mapping could be used, and visual markers could be used to give more information, in fact. We're unable to do that on this map, but I think it's pretty easy to see how that could be done with the ability to, well, with coders that would be at our disposal to do our bidding. In terms of the Nottingham submissions, I'm not sure that the individual is, and Claire could correct me on this, whether he's linking up a lot of different locations to show connections between places, because they really cover, happily, they cover quite a few, well, many generations. And I don't think he's thinking about them. My sense is, and of course I'm speaking on behalf of someone I've never met, my sense is that he has an almost encyclopedic interest. And it's more about pointing out all of those places in the past as discrete places that had significance that collectively now show there was something going on across generations and across time and to the present. But what do you think, Claire?
It's mostly sort of chair events and queer activist events that happened anywhere from the 1960s, and because they would have happened in different locations, they've all sort of been mapped. So it does look like it's this massive clear hub and has been for ages. But I think if they've lived around the area and they know that these events happened at these different places, then it isn't encyclopedic. So it is, perhaps it's a bit false, but these all happened. It would just be amazing for someone from every city and town and rural area who could do the same.
And perhaps he's taken a really good way of approaching it as well, of saying, instead of just saying, well, this organization was based here, he's actually mapping all the events that they might have held at different times that were resonant for him. And I think, speaking maybe a bit further to what the gentleman in the back was asking about others using this information, I think something like Nottingham now is very well mapped. Someone might be able to draw links and extract further information about the connections between those places that the man who submitted it might not have been thinking about or intended, but which it nonetheless illuminates.
Well, the problem with the map is that it's, it could go on forever and it would have hundreds of thousands and millions of places on it. So there's an arbitrariness to what lands up on it. And absolutely, the material is formed by the method, which was a very off-the-shelf system that we could get cheaply and quickly in the first part of this project. So it's, it kind of worries me in some ways. I mean, I want to be one of those methodical people who make sure that every place is on there and that everything is accountable. But I mean, that's never going to happen. It's going to be a partial, uneven kind of record of those people who have contributed and what they felt was important, and what we try to nudge along. So that's 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 one of my kind of concerns about the map. But I mean, that there's no sort of answer to that. It's going to be what it is. But yeah, we were quite interested in the networks, and when either of us, and Claire and other people on the project have spoken at various events, it's really alerted us to, what were the queer neighbourhoods, what were my queer neighbourhoods in the 1980s, and how have they changed? I mean, it's that sort of shifting of histories which we would love to capture, and hopefully we can get enough material on there to give a sense of that change happening. In the other project, we're looking at migration, but yeah, that's probably a different set of sources.
I'm interested in how this project comes up against this governmental Congo that has this major function around designating and assessing significant and listing and scheduling places. So obviously your map is partly related to this function that's very place focused on buildings and schedule nation monuments. So I just wondered whether, and that judges that designate on the basis of significance and judging significance. So I wondered how much you had to agitate within that governmental Congo to get it to think about significance differently?
Well, that is a very pertinent question. And I mean, I would say that, I can't remember that, I think there are 4 different types of significance, architectural, merit, aesthetic, endorsements and so on. But social and cultural significance has been part of the, has been a factor that can be cited in recommending to a government, because it's not historic England that makes these decisions, except as far as they're the gatekeepers. So social and cultural significance has been there for a while. I'm not quite sure for how long, but certainly it's not, extremely new. It's just, I suppose, historic England has now, or at least some of the teams within historic England now want to make that become more relevant and important for future designation. And so we are helping them in that process. That's not really a very good answer, but yeah, they want to, their teams wish to do this, and we are going, within the team, we have some expertise in the sense that one of my colleagues at Leeds, Beckett, used to write designation recommendations for English heritage about 10 years ago, and Rob Bevan, our architectural consultant specialist, was involved with the LBT and has also been involved in listing and so on. So hopefully we'll bring some external perspectives to historic England.
Some of the questions you raised about crowdsourcing are really about different kinds of significances and, how you deal with the boundaries of significance and credibility, authority, and those kinds of issues. I think essentially there's something really interesting there about how government administers significance in relation to what you're doing.
No, absolutely, and historic England is doing it more widely beyond this project. I can't remember the name of they're launching a new initiative so that people can write about places that matter to them generally and have plans on the website. That's probably more form-filling type thing than a mapping exercise, and it hasn't started yet. But this is part of their desire to push the process of projecting the environment and historic places out there to the public, to have more responsibility taken by more people. And now I'm sounding like I'm speaking on behalf of Historic England, and it is interesting working with an organisation like that as their consultants in the project. And we don't necessarily see very much because we work through 2 or 3 or 4 including quite senior people in Historic England, but we don't really see an awful lot of the processes that go on beyond those 3 or 4 people who by definition are very supportive of the project.
Historic England has also been very interested in finding out which of the locations that have been plotted on the map are already listed. And so they've this one woman in Swindon has been putting a tremendous amount of time going through a spreadsheet of 1,000 locations that I sent her, of the first 1,000 locations, and comparing. And there's going to be some judgment calls on which ones are likely to be already listed, but she's going through this list to find out which ones are already listed. And you might have noticed when we showed the map, there was a blue box up at the very top that said heritage information. That will link through to the official listing information of any buildings that are already listed. So even if there's not current one, and for 99.99% of buildings, there's not any information about their queer past. There's the RVT. This still creates a link for people looking at the map to the official listing and demonstrates from Historic England that there are queer heritage significances to already listed buildings, and will be influenced, of course, by these locations and the information that's been submitted and other research in our recommendations for amendments to the listings to acknowledge that better. Interestingly, we've also been discovering in the process of uncovering which locations are already listed, some that have suggestive information already in them, where individuals, whoever wrote the original listing information, included, there's examples of a site, a cross dedicated to the site where Piers Gaveston was killed, and it mentions him being the favorite of Edward II. Okay, that's a fairly famous individual of the past, but I think what's more interesting, perhaps, is another example is a house in Chertsey, in Surrey, a modernist house, where the listing information describes the architect of the house and the commissioner of the house, and it's a high modernist house. It's a great story. That one I love. I could go on for a while, but interestingly, it talks about the architect taking up residence in the house for a while, and that he was living at the house. It suggests that it was shorter than what it appears to have been, because the architect and the commissioner were in fact a same-sex couple, which, if you know a little bit more about the house, you can start reading between the lines. But the information is there. It just feels it feels very quaint and dated in the way it's presented. But it's interesting uncovering these references and these bits of code that I believe, I haven't seen more, but I believe if we went through them, we'd find a few more references like that. So there's interesting things that are there. I'd almost want to preserve some of those as a sort of historical artifact in historic England.
Before we take the next question, I'm just going to suggest that after that we go and have some wine and juice and nibbles and stuff and carry on our conversations. Seems like a good moment to do so. So if you want to finish us off then.
Firstly, I'll say thank you for introducing the website. Great talk. I remember when it launched, and I was glad you changed the software because I wasn't actually adding anything on your website in June, or late June or early July. What I find interesting looking at it just now on my phone is that it hasn't really, in London, it hasn't really changed so that much. It might be a bit more, but it's still very much saunas and pubs. And the only location I could find that was an address was Dennis Nilsson's house, which is not exactly great. Things like the Bethnal Rouge squat and the Queer London squat, the GLF. I think there was one GLF collective and him, and he said that's wrong. And stuff like that, it's sort of, and I'm wondering how you're going to open that press before September, whether there's a way of actually building that, because those are more kind of like political and also residents, and they're less kind of obviously visible, but they're very important. And actually, for instance, Newham did get history month, and they listed Bethnal Rouge and the various other places, where Betsy Gordon's, the Grateful Dead squat, and that kind of thing. And the other one is about your talk. It was about the Royal Vauxhall Tavern, which I've been kind of going to for years, and also involved with the Black Cat campaign. And I think that probably happened because of the Black Cat frozen, and the gentrification is shifting. That's why this debate's happening about preserving these places, either from a standpoint or also Bengry. It's because the gentrification is destroying them. Joy's Arms, you've got Menbar, you've got British Counter, you've got Mortgage, all the parts have gone in the last 10 years. So it's also the history being eaten away as well.
Well, with locations that haven't yet been mapped, I think we're optimistic to some extent that there's a momentum building as the project goes forward, that more and more is being submitted. So we are watching things continuing to be submitted every week, and some of those gaps are being filled. And we're also hoping that people like you will look at this and be like, I can't believe they've left that off, and be spurred to action now that it's much easier.
It's also not my experience.
I think there's an issue here which we get the Higher Education Funding Council interested, because there's a whole linked data issue about how you get the Hall Carpenter Archive and the London School of Economics to be linked data federated search into the project. And projects are always about chasing more sources of money, and somebody has to be enthusiastic about chasing more sources of money. And I wonder whether doing like English Heritage, FKey connection might be worth somebody putting a bottle of wine. I put a bottle of wine on the table in order to try and facilitate making it happen.
Well, there's amazing linkages that can be made between not just the locations, but archival collections, all kinds of other collections. It can open up information far beyond this project itself. I think I had meetings with LSE, and they're thrilled for people to come use the collection and start mapping things. And we've had the diverse collections manager at the National Archives has also been very interested in the project, and we've talked about having then catalog references. If there's a site that can be located on the map that refers to something in their collections, we can put the catalog reference in our web reference box that then will take someone right to the catalog entry at the National Archives, and that kind of thing has incredible potential as well. It's just, again, it's that massive amount of labor that goes into doing that. The enthusiasm, the interest is there, but the practicality of doing it is the biggest obstacle.
Can I just make a couple of points to follow on from that, which is that, I mean, Historic England have funded this project to with a larger sum of money than some of the other diversity projects that they have previously funded, but it's still really not very much money at all in terms of, costing numbers of people and their days and so on. So if anyone has any ideas to take this forward or any suggestions for collaborators, that would be great. And also just to go back to the listings question, we are charged as part of this project to suggest listing amendments to places that are already designated, but also to suggest new potential listings. So please don't hesitate to let us know if you have sites in mind, which of course includes gardens, landscapes, or buildings. Well, not the listing now, but buildings that have existed in the past but no longer exist. We can also sort of add to Historic England Archives. So please give some suggestions, and hopefully we've inspired some of you to do some more mapping. And thanks very much to our volunteers who already did some mapping.
Are we in the IHR common room? So IHR common room, if you're going to join us, there'll be wine and other drinks and nibbles, and let's carry on.